Hello, everyone. Following the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests, much of the world is once again discussing the issue of racism. The protests have been successful in bringing to the forefront a concept known as systemic racism. This concept tells us that racist structures are deeply embedded in every segment of social and political life. That includes even institutions that deems itself to be progressive, which includes the debate community. In this series of interviews, we want to explore how racism can manifest itself in the debate community and what the community can do to dismantle these structures and become more inclusive. We're incredibly happy to have this conversation with a wide range of knowledgeable and insightful voices. Today, I'm speaking with Martha Muir. Martha is concluding her degree in politics at Durham University in the UK. Whilst there, she's been the director of debates at Durham Union and also the convener of the Durham Schools Debating Championships. Martha, very welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Let's start with just asking you briefly about your history in debate education itself. Why did you join? What did you get out of it?
So I first started doing debate in sixth form. I had about a week's training in BP before doing Oxford schools. And that was a scary experience. And so I quit for a year and then didn't go back to it until I was at Durham. And then when I started at Durham, I went through the novice, intermediate, and eventually advanced streams. And I've spoken at competitions in the UK, in Ireland, in Europe, and I got to go to Euros and Worlds a couple of times. So I've come from doing not very much at all to getting to be involved in quite a few different aspects of it.
Very cool, yeah, and I think very good to hear as well, because I imagine some people might have the idea that things like Euros or Worlds are there only for like a select few, but what I think you show is that if you just enjoy the activity, if you work at the activity, those are also things you can do as well, and you can grow into them, isn't it? Okay.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Definitely. I think that sometimes in debating we like to say that either you can only do well and be successful if you're a world schoolie, or kind of say that there are absolutely no barriers at all. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. Like, I think if you don't have the world schools experience, you do have to work incredibly hard. But I think that if you put the effort in, I think, and the conditions are favourable to you, I think it's possible. So I think debating is a good activity in that regard compared to like pro football or whatever.
And I saw you also have been a centre forward at the local university sports team, and that must have then been much more for enjoyment, right?
Yeah, very, very amateurly though. I'm on the kind of team where they let absolutely anyone join, but I tend to think that is more fun than like the intense training kind of model.
Then moving on to a topic at which I'm sure you have a large amount of things to say about now. So what I'd like to start with perhaps is maybe clarifying some scope, because what you very often see in societal conversations surrounding discrimination, racism, and prejudice is that people get a bit hung up about a certain set of definitions. So broadly speaking, you can both have the type of racism where like an individual is very explicitly prejudiced, such as happens in movies like Green Book or Crashed. There are scenarios where people have far more like ingrained viewpoints that they aren't necessarily aware of themselves, but do mean that they handle themselves in terms of like using pejorative stereotypes or outdated ideas of thinking around people. And there are systems or structures that disadvantage people, both like very explicit structures. I'm thinking here of the Windrush generation in the UK who got denied a visa because of where they were from, but also sometimes more neutral systems that proclaim to be neutral but have like differential outcomes on the basis of race, such as like funding school districts on the basis of the average property price, which tends to disenfranchise people who come from minority backgrounds because they tend to own less property or less expensive property. Which of these definitions or examples of racism do you think best fit within the forms in which it materializes within debate?
I think definitely, I forget the exact word you use, but the kind of implicit kind where people are on paper against racism and would probably go out of their way to try and prevent like egregious acts of racism, but where they might have implicit biases, kind of that they formed from the media and politics and even like other people in that debate society and discourses they've heard on the debate circuit, which they don't necessarily self-critique, and I think a lot of them end up getting perpetuated. And I think a lot of those critiques a lot of the things that they say are on the face of it quite positive. Like oftentimes it's phrased in a kind of we must help the minorities kind of way, but it becomes quite patronizing and like they're kind of talking about people whose experiences they don't share from a very top-down perspective. And that to me is racist. But I think people's idea of racism is that it has to be like you're wearing a white hood and burning a cross. And so I think there's a bit of a communication disconnect there.
Very good. So that sounds to me also as something that must feel troubling to you. So how does how does that language, why does that feel racist to you? What is the impact of it? How do you experience these kind of things?
So I think it's racist in that I think it assumes that minorities and people of color have less agency and ability than white people, because I think something I hear quite a lot in debates is, if they're talking about black people, the framing will automatically be, well, they come from like neighborhoods riddled with crime and like they need extra support and stuff like that, or like the communities they live in are like really dangerous and stuff like that. And so I think that even if you're coming at that from a place of sympathy, it does kind of convey that you think that minorities are just more likely to know criminals or like not have jobs or not be educated. And that to me, as I said, it comes from a well-meaning place, but it makes me feel like perhaps they view me as somebody who doesn't have the kind of similar life experiences to them, and somebody that they maybe need to take pity on.
Yeah, and I think very often in the debate community, this is the cry, this so-called essentializing language, right? Where people who may tend to have certain experiences are defined only in terms of having those experiences, and we believe that people all who come from that background all supposedly have had that experience. And you rightfully point out it can feel very demeaning.
An example of that I found very interesting is I think there is a kind of tendency to run like the minority extension without kind of explaining what minorities you're talking about and why the particular motion is going to impact them. Like a good example of this is that I've often heard it said in debates about like protest movements such as Black Lives Matter, that they don't have to worry about getting the black community on side. Like it's just taken as a given that all black people love Black Lives Matter and that we'll like run out and protest when it's going on. And I think that's an assumption that isn't true. Like I know lots of black people who support the end goals of Black Lives Matter, but they don't like the kind of confrontation style that they take. And suggesting that we wouldn't excuse if we were talking about like harder motions like econ motions. Like I think there's a kind of reluctance to case file and take social justice motions seriously, which does end up in people making like lazy stereotypes and saying, well, minorities are affected by this in X way, minorities feel Y way about this, and that's just not true. And it makes for bad arguments, I think.
Yeah, so it sounds a bit like recently Joe Biden was, I think, characterized for having made the comment that if you don't vote Democrat, you're black. And these type of like very narrow portrayals is at the core of the problem. So I'm interested to see how we could potentially like seek to fix this in the best way possible. So I think one of the things you said is that people ought to case file better or read up on this better. Obviously, that depends upon individuals actually doing that kind of work. Do you think that this can happen, or what are ways in which you can encourage people to be better read on this?
So I think it does, in a way, rely on individuals and societies taking the initiative on this. But if they wanted to do that, then there are loads of like great resources they could use to case file. And I also think it's about society heads like training people in a different way and encouraging them to do case filing on the subjects that they think are soft. And I think it's also really important that chair judges call out bad arguments. This is a bit circular because maybe they don't recognize that it's a bad argument. But I feel like when people are given criticism regarding the way they talk about minorities, they kind of assume it's an equity complaint and they kind of either like gush out an apology or they get turned off. But I think it's useful for chair judges to say, like, your argument's not bad, it's just, your argument's not like offensive, it's just bad because you made X, Y, and Z assumptions. And so I feel like better training for people at the top of the ladder probably feeds down into better training and like better sensitivity and better arguments for people at the bottom. And then I think because a lot of things in the debate community do just self-replicate, I think that's the way to probably go about it. But it does rely on societies deciding to do this. And I guess the only way that we can make that happen is by providing resources, which is something that I was thinking about for the past few months.
Hmm. That does sound like a very good approach to maybe try and get towards, and hopefully this is the type of resource that could also help, maybe at least providing the awareness that the problem exists. Maybe also within how to, but I think some of the suggestions you've given from not to do it sounds like a corollary as well.
Yeah.
And I imagine one of the things you mentioned here is in terms of chair judges. Could part of the problem be, as I've spoken with someone else, be that many of the chair judges themselves don't share these experiences, and therefore maybe a stronger diversity in who you put on judging panels to be part of the solution here?
So instinctively, yes, but I think that I don't think that the problem starts with people of color not getting to chair. I think the problem starts with the fact that there aren't enough people of color in debating who get the experience level they need to become chairs. So my answer is kind of yes and no. Like, I don't necessarily think we should push people into chair for their own sake, but I do think it's a problem that the kind of people who have rep and whose opinions carry enough weight for them to be in the chair are often of a certain background. Because I think that although we like to pretend that like the average reasonable, informed, unbiased, whatever we call it now, voter doesn't have any of these biases, I think that if you are a chair who has a certain life experience and you're weighing two arguments, if the teams haven't done it really well for you, sometimes you're going to favor the one that makes more intuitive sense to you. And that could be that a protest movement should do everything they possibly can not to piss off white people, because God forbid. And then the black wing, or like the wing of color, might have a slightly different take on that. And so I feel like, yeah, until we have enough chairs who kind of have a diverse range of views, maybe that wing won't feel empowered to speak up. But I do think that that problem starts way before anyone is selected to be a chair.
Mm-hmm. I think I want to put a pin in that idea about like when the selection happens and maybe discuss that in a bit. But what I'm also thinking right now is this also then means that the community as a whole would ask quite a large amount of their black debaters. If there's not that many of them right now, and certainly not that many of them who are at the top who frequently give out trainings and such, that means that sort of like we're asking black debaters to solve the problem of anti-black prejudice. And that does feel like there's a bit of a tension there, isn't there?
So my approach with things like this is that you shouldn't expect black people, black debaters to do all of the work, but there are enough people who want to do the work. And so I feel like there's sometimes that's used as an excuse to not take them up on it. Like in the past year, I think like since Cape Town Worlds, there's been an explosion of like black debaters talking about their experiences and like providing resources and stuff. So obviously you shouldn't walk up to a random black person at a competition and be like, you sir are going to educate me. But I think that there is a fairly large community of us who do want to improve the community. So it's not really a case of forcing people into jobs that they don't want, I think.
Okay, that's very good to hear, and I guess also it confers upon everyone to be, in a sense, be patient with each other and teach them to learn that type of respect. And I think that also confers on someone who's made the pejorative remarks in the debate to really be open to learning and improving. And that just does sound more to me in that sense.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things you highlight as well is that, of course, there are not an enormous amount of minorities. I mean, it's sort of in the term who exist within the debate sphere. Is there something that goes explicitly wrong in the recruitment process, in the onboarding process, that should be improved?
So I think it probably depends on every different club and every different circuit, because I think probably part of the problem in Iona is that there are very few clubs with people of colour in them. And I do just think that you tend to gravitate towards clubs where you not necessarily look like everyone else there, but where you feel like you won't not fit in. And then I think if you get people to stay for a couple of taster sessions and they hear people kind of discussing their life experiences in a really like flippant way, it's not that they'll hate debating, it might just be that they find it a better investment of their time to go to football or something. And so I do think the problem is that there are probably not enough like high profile people there in the first place. But then, yeah, I think the problem varies like society by society though, because I think that on some levels there is a lot of diversity in the debate community. Like I think if you look at worlds, like there are a fair few people of color, but I think most of them come from like societies in countries which are majority people of color. Whereas I think that this just needs to be discussed on a much more micro level, because obviously worlds is not a white competition, but if you look at Iona societies, they are pretty white, and so I think it would probably be a good idea if they did like explicit outreach, or like had to think about why they're not attracting so many people.
Yeah, I think that does sound very good, because I very often do hear that like societies, I mean, obviously there's a bit of a time constraint and often you have new people who come in to organize the start, but they tend to not do much more than run the standard gamut of activities during a freshers week or equivalent, and thinking where specifically the outreach can be done better.
Yeah.
At least sounds like an easier step to try and achieve. So we then see that in some scenarios with where these people make these pejorative comments, that people have say that this could be a very good learning experience, and in fact we find out that someone has a pejorative viewpoint once they express it. On the other hand, as you rightfully point out, it's also very upsetting to come across, and there are some people who say maybe we shouldn't like set these type of topics, maybe set them only in out rounds, so that the learning opportunity is there without necessarily being exposed to potentially the worst kind of these examples. What's your view on this? How should we look at things like motion setting and weighing the potential learning experience with the harmful exposure?
So I am of the view that not pretty much everything, but I'm kind of more of the view that you should tend to err on the side of setting motions which are quote unquote uncomfortable. Like I'm kind of uncomfortable with the idea of not setting particular debates because of the personal experiences of people at that competition, because I think that means that you can't set a whole ton of debates. I am somewhat a fan of setting more gnarly debates in out rounds, just because I think that newer debaters, probably more than more experienced debaters, tend to watch out rounds they're not in, and that's a useful way of learning what kind of things are and aren't okay to say. I guess with regards to whether I think that whether it's a good learning experience, I think that it is if that learning experience happens, which goes back to the idea of whether that person is told that they said something which is racist, and whether the chair deals with that, whether it's incumbent on a like new fresher to call that person out, because that might make the difference between whether they listen to the complaint or not. And I think that there is probably a problem in the way that we handle equity with regards to that, because I think that too often when equity violations happen, somebody gets pulled aside into a room and they're told like, you did a bad thing, and so they'll never say it again in a debate. But I think they're a bit put off by how adversarial it feels, and so I think that probably a better way to make it these kind of things a learning experience is to kind of have a discussion about it, which doesn't take the form of an accusation. I think that's when I've had the best chats with people about race and stuff in debate. So the answer to your question is sometimes yes, sometimes no, but it's kind of contextual, and it depends on us having good structures in place already.
I think that's very important indeed. So as an example, I could imagine therefore to be saying that if a CA team has come up with a motion they think is very, very good, but could potentially lead to more people making these kind of mistakes, they hopefully already like work within a system where trainings have been offered to people, certainly those who might be offering judgment, or if not, they might even be able to solicit such a training. They might want to, in the 50 minutes of preparation time, suggest to the judges this is an issue that might come up, and be aware of that in your debrief, but not necessarily treat it immediately as a situation where we need to put people in front of an equity panel only at the moment where indeed the victim truly feels that equity could be the right course of action. Okay, that actually sounds like an incredibly helpful way, and not necessarily a way I have seen whilst I was active in debate of handling these issues. So that type of nuance I think is very important.
Yeah, I also think, just as a small suggestion, because I think small suggestions can make all the difference, I think that there is a noticeable difference when you announce beforehand that a motion has the potential to be gnarly, because I don't think it disrupts people from prepping properly, but I do think that it signals that you should maybe be a bit more careful in the kind of generalizations you make. And that's something which I've seen at some competitions and not others. Like I have seen motions where I thought maybe there should have been that kind of announcement. I've actually CA'd a few competitions where I had to make the announcement as the CA because equity were like, oh, I don't know. So I feel like if that was like better codified, then we could potentially snuff out like silly but often significant mistakes that people make when they're talking about groups and stuff.
Okay, very good. Now we're speaking to each other in a time where I think we're having not just within the debate community, but a wider societal conversation surrounding tackling racism. But as you mentioned, in the past, there have been moments where incidents surrounding racism have come to the fore and have then led to like a community-wide conversation, very often focused on social media. And you express your desire to speak a bit more about that. So could you tell me, what do you think? How did those conversations happen? And what's the problem there?
So I think that it would be great for the debate community if we spent less time on our phones, because I have never seen so much like toxicity in real life. I know of debaters who don't get on, but I've never seen the kind of conversations happen in real life that happen online. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, I do think that debating gives you a mindset where you have to win the argument or lose. And so I feel like when people see a take online that they don't agree with, they're not necessarily considering, how do I like learn from, like, how do I come to see this person's perspective? I think their first instinct is to write a paragraph that will often end in like a sassy line, and they're hoping to get tons of likes or whatever. But then I think that the problem there is that if that kind of comment is made by somebody who has quote unquote rep in the community, they'll get a bunch of likes, and then people who look up to them will think that that take is the correct take. And I think that that informs people's views of topics that we're debating. Like, I'm not necessarily saying what side I fall on, for instance, like the Cape Town debate or like the debate the other day about whether that motion at Trinity should have been set. But I do think that the willingness of people to pile on and kind of support like debaters with rep whose opinions aren't necessarily that informed does kind of bleed down into the way that younger debaters like think about these issues, and I think that that makes them like less keen to have like constructive conversations, if that makes sense.
I think there's a lot in there that's very important that you highlight there, indeed. So one of the things, I mean, I've seen plenty of these debates happen on social media, and I've had some unfortunate participation in some of them myself as well. Is that we do see that these type of discussions, I should point out that it can lead to what's point scoring, that there is that people on social media tend to interact already on the basis of quite argumentative stances, because that's a operation that we see certainly on Twitter, but also on other social media where people think that they might be in the right. And I think very important is you're often either missing a lot of context because you don't know who's in front of you, the other side of the screen. You don't see what their reaction is to what you're saying. And I think also what I've seen happen a bit more recently is that some of these discussions start out on meme groups or shitposting groups, which means that the tone already is quite some steps removed from constructive conversation. So I think there's a very good appeal to be set there.
Yeah, and I do think that it creates a chilling effect. Like, I think that I don't want to be that person who says like don't meme about serious topics, but I think that if you are discussing a potentially quite serious issue and you make it clear that you think that that issue is worthy of being memed about, either on like debating shitposting or like the Balkan page, then you are implicitly saying to people who might share that concern that they're going to be ridiculed if they try to address that point. And I think that it's obviously fine to disagree with the thing that the person is saying, but I think that it's a bit like playground level when all too often these kinds of discussions become like 100 comment page threads and there's like tons of memes about it, but then by the time council happens, and like I'm guilty of this, like everyone's hungover so they don't go. Like, that's not the way to think about these issues in our community, whatever side of the debate you fall down on, I think.
Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it might be very useful if like people listening to this conversation, like next time that they see this happen, say to themselves, not just pause for myself for a little bit, but maybe also ask other people to pause or create a different forum or venue for this kind of conversation to happen. Like I imagine that much less of this goes on indeed at councils sessions, which to be frank, are more mind-numbingly boring often than they are explicitly
Yeah.
oppositional towards people, but they might be better suited for us. And even I think now we see with the capacity of everyone pushing themselves into Zoom for like endless debate tournaments and weekends, that people could convene these kind of moments when they do see them occurring.
I think something I'd also want people to be aware of is that I think that this phenomenon I've been talking about is like happens to a great degree with race as opposed to other issues in the debate community, because I feel like on some level, if you can, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of easy to have an argument about what a particular rule is in debating or what it should be, because you can kind of talk about debates you've been in and like look at the world's manual. Like I feel like it's easy to kind of have more technical discussions than it is to about race, because oftentimes race is about lived experiences. And so oftentimes people are in the position of being like having to prove that X, Y, or Z thing happened. And because obviously, as we were saying, racism can be quite implicit, it's very difficult to do that on an online forum. And so they'll get pissed off and then the other side will get pissed off. Whereas I feel like if these conversations happen face to face, like sure, you can't provide receipts, but I feel like if you're talking to a person and you can kind of see how upset they are and they're kind of talking to you about their experiences, there might not be this tendency to like snark at them, and then there might not be this tendency of the other side to like snark back at them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me is, so I mean, I'm an English second language debater, and when I started debating, I think it was pretty much considered a given that things like ESL bias exists, so that I don't think I would have to prove that if I'd come out in that. And I think similarly, in my first year's university debating, when it was the incident in Glasgow where two female debaters were heckled due to their sex, after that a shift happened where you no longer had to prove per se that sexism exists in debating, but that was taken as a given, and we moved at the very least on from there. Is there a reason you think why that hasn't yet happened surrounding allegations of racism?
I think maybe because I guess there are fewer. I mean, one maybe because there are fewer people of color on the circuit, and like I said before, I think people of color on the world circuit are quite stratified. So it might not be that like Asian or like African debaters are kind of used to having these kinds of conversations with like. Does that make sense? Like I feel like because oftentimes people of color are literally on different continents. It's maybe taken as a given there that there'll be less racism, and the other parts of the world which are a bit whiter haven't had to engage with that in the same way. And so we're kind of meeting each other for this tournament like once a year, and there's a bit of a mismatch in priorities. But I also kind of just think that maybe I don't know exactly how ESL status people campaign for like more awareness of that problem. But I think that maybe there just isn't enough social capital for people to care about race yet, and I don't know why that is. Hopefully that will change, but I feel like at some point enough people maybe started caring about certain issues like sexism and ESL bias, and that hasn't happened yet. But a way that I do think that can be countered is by like promoting POC speakers and like the African and like Asian circuits being like better appreciated by the like whiter circuits.
And I do want to echo
listening to their concerns more.
Yeah, and I do want to echo that point as well. Like I've throughout this interview series have had the opportunity to already speak with some debaters from the African continent, with whom I myself have very little experience, having only gone to Africa for debating once when I attended Cape Town Worlds. And it just means that you are less aware of the various ways in which it can permeate. And similarly, as you point out, in Europe, the European circuit, there just are far fewer debaters of color who share that interaction in majority white spaces. So hopefully as well, as you point out, having these type of conversations, and I hope that this is a part of it that can contribute, could help move the needle on this issue more forward.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there at this stage anything else that you feel is very important that we still should discuss?
Nothing with regards to topics. I guess my like takeaway from all of this is just like, I think it's important to assume good faith in the vast majority of people you meet, at least unless you have a particular reason to not believe they're acting in good faith. And so I feel like that would look like in the community wanting to listen and take at face value when someone says they feel like they've been targeted because of their race or whatever. And I think it also involves us not assuming that people who fuck up are bad people, because I feel like that does bad things for making them want to engage. And I also just think it's important for people to not assume that it's somebody else's problem, because I feel like if you, like I said earlier, I feel like if you dig hard enough if you dig in the community, there are enough people who want to tell people how to talk about minorities in debates more. Don't just assume it's a kind of foregone conclusion that like you can't talk about this kind of thing, because we do want to talk about these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's very important to round it up with. Indeed, I indeed get the feeling that if we do live in a society where racism without racists exists, as the refrain that's been sometimes echoed in progressive spheres, it is indeed important to recognize that it is not because someone wants to harm you; it's that they didn't know better. But hopefully, over that, if you explain it to them, that they then actually do want to know better, so they should open themselves to knowing better. I think that's a very good way to end things on. Thank you very much, Martha. This was
no problem. Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Good to hear, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. You too.